I never thought I'd be grateful for a lawyer's phone call at 6:47 in the morning, but there I was, standing in my tiny studio apartment kitchen, still in my pajamas, listening to words that would change everything. "Sarah, you need to sit down," Mr. Henderson said, his voice careful and measured. "Your father's will has been read, and there's something you need to know." I gripped the phone tighter, my coffee mug forgotten on the counter. Dad had been gone for 3 weeks, and I hadn't even been invited to the funeral. Victoria, my stepmother, had made sure of that. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story really begins 12 years earlier, when I was 16, and my world fell apart in the span of a single summer. My mother had died the year before from cancer, a slow, devastating battle that left my father hollow and me drowning in grief we never learned how to share. Dad threw himself into work at his construction company, building houses for other families while ours crumbled in silence. I spent most of my time at the library or wandering around town, avoiding the empty spaces where Mom's laughter used to fill our house. That's when Victoria swept in like a tornado disguised as a gentle breeze. She was everything my mother wasn't, loud where Mom had been thoughtful, flashy where Mom had been elegant, demanding where Mom had been patient. She had perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, nails that could cut glass, and a smile that seemed painted on every morning. She worked as a real estate agent and drove a bright red convertible that she parked in our driveway like she was claiming territory. Victoria had 2 children from her previous marriage, twins Marcus and Melissa, who were my age but might as well have been from another planet. They attended private school, had matching designer backpacks, and spoke in that casual way wealthy kids do about expensive vacations and brand names like they were discussing the weather. When Victoria moved in with her children 6 months after, meeting my father, she didn't just bring boxes and furniture. She brought a complete reorganization of our lives. The changes started small, almost reasonable. Victoria suggested we redecorate the living room because it was too dark and depressing. She convinced Dad that the old family photos cluttering the mantel made the house feel stuck in the past. She replaced Mom's favorite armchair, the one where she used to read to me every night, with a sleek white sofa that no one was allowed to sit on with street clothes. Each alteration felt like another piece of my mother being erased, but Dad seemed relieved to let someone else make decisions about our home. Within a year, Victoria and Dad were married in a small ceremony at City Hall. I wasn't included in the planning, just told when to show up and what to wear. The reception was held at an expensive restaurant downtown, filled with Victoria's friends and Dad's business associates. I sat at a corner table with Marcus and Melissa, who spent the entire evening complaining about the music and making plans for spring break in Cancun. No one mentioned my mother, not even once, as if the first 16 years of Dad's life had been a practice round for the real thing. The house transformation accelerated after the marriage. Victoria claimed she wanted to make it feel like home for everyone, but her version of home looked like a magazine spread where children weren't supposed to exist. The kitchen got a complete renovation with white marble countertops that showed every fingerprint and stainless steel appliances that required constant polishing. My mother's garden, where she had grown tomatoes and sunflowers and taught me the names of every herb, was replaced with a perfectly manicured landscape of decorative rocks and plants that looked pretty but served no purpose. My bedroom was the last refuge, the one space Victoria couldn't touch without seeming openly hostile. It still had the pale yellow walls Mom and I had painted together, the bookshelf Dad built when I was 12, the desk where I did homework while Mom cooked dinner, nearby. But even there, I started feeling like a guest in my own home. Victoria would comment on the mess when I left clothes on the floor, suggest I might want to update my decorating style to something more mature, hint that the room could be better utilized for something else. The financial changes were more subtle but equally devastating. Dad had always been generous, not wealthy, but comfortable enough that I never worried about money for school supplies or clothes or occasional treats. After Victoria arrived, every expense became a negotiation. When I needed money for a school trip, Victoria would sigh and mention how expensive Marcus's soccer equipment had been that month. When I wanted to take driving lessons, she'd point out that Melissa's dance classes were already stretching the budget. Dad would eventually give me what I needed, but always with an undertone of guilt, as if my existence was becoming a burden on the family finances. The twins, meanwhile, seemed to have unlimited resources. They got new phones every year, designer, clothes for every season, and their rooms were redecorated whenever they got bored with the current theme. Marcus had a gaming setup that cost more than my entire wardrobe, and Melissa's closet looked like a boutique showroom. When I asked Dad about the disparity, he'd mumble something about them having different needs, or Victoria managing the household budget better than he ever could. School became my escape, but even there, the differences followed me. Marcus and Melissa attended Westfield Academy, a private school across town with small classes and college counselors who helped students navigate applications to Ivy League universities. I stayed in the public school system, where overcrowded classrooms and overwhelmed teachers meant you were on your own for most things. When graduation approached, they had professional college consultants helping them craft perfect applications, while I filled out forms at the library using outdated guidebooks. Victoria made a show of being interested in my education, asking about my grades and future plans at dinner, but her questions always felt like performance rather than genuine care. She'd nod approvingly when I mentioned good test scores, then immediately launch into praise for Marcus's acceptance into the Honor Society or Melissa's lead role in the school play. Dad would sit quietly during these conversations, sometimes catching my eye across the table with what might have been sympathy, but he never spoke up or shifted the focus back to me. The summer before my senior year, I got a part-time job at a local bookstore to save money for college applications and have some independence. Victoria was openly critical of this decision, claiming it would interfere with my studies and make me too tired to focus on important things. She suggested I should spend the summer volunteering instead, building character and college resume credentials like Marcus and Melissa were doing at expensive camps and internship programs their mother had arranged. When I pointed out that I needed money for college expenses, Victoria smiled tightly and said that responsible planning would have prevented this situation. College applications became a minefield of subtle sabotage. Victoria would forget to remind me about deadlines. She remembered perfectly for her own children. Important mail would get buried under stacks of catalogs and advertisements on the kitchen counter. When I asked Dad for help with the financial aid forms, Victoria would interrupt with pressing concerns about household repairs or dinner plans that required his immediate attention. She never directly prevented me from applying to schools, but she created enough obstacles and distractions that I missed opportunities and settled for less than what I might have achieved with proper support. Despite the challenges, I managed to get accepted to State University with a partial scholarship that would cover most of my tuition. I was proud of this accomplishment, having achieved it entirely through my own effort, but the celebration was muted. Dad seemed pleased but distracted, already deep in discussions with Victoria about Marcus's acceptance to an expensive private college and Melissa's plans for studying abroad. My achievement felt small in comparison to their elaborate futures, like a participation trophy next to Olympic gold medals. Moving away to college provided relief from the daily comparisons and subtle slights, but it also meant losing touch with Dad in ways that worried me. Our phone conversations became brief and infrequent, partly because I was busy with classes and work, but mostly because Victoria always seemed to be in the background, monitoring and managing his time. When I called, she'd answer and chat for several minutes about her own children's accomplishments before reluctantly handing the phone to Dad, who would sound rushed and distracted during our conversations. Holiday visits home were exercises in feeling invisible. The house would be perfectly decorated for Christmas or Thanksgiving, with family photos prominently displayed throughout the living room and hallway. but the photos told a specific story. One where Dad's new family took center stage while I appeared in only a handful of older pictures tucked into less prominent spots. Victoria would greet me warmly enough, asking about school and friends, but her attention would quickly shift to her own children's more exciting updates about internships, relationships, and future plans. Gift exchanges during these visits highlighted the disparities in ways that felt deliberately cruel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus and Melissa would receive expensive electronics, jewelry, or cash tucked into elaborate gift bags, while I'd get practical items like socks or generic gift cards with much smaller amounts. Dad would always slip me some extra money privately, later, apologizing quietly for the difference, but his guilty generosity felt worse than the original slight. I didn't want pity money. I wanted to feel like I belonged in my own family. During my junior year of college, Dad was diagnosed with diabetes, a condition that required significant lifestyle changes and regular medical monitoring. I offered to come home and help, but Victoria assured me that she had everything under control. She hired a house cleaner, arranged for meal delivery services, and reorganized Dad's schedule around his medical appointments. On the surface, she appeared to be the perfect caregiver, but I noticed during phone calls that Dad sounded increasingly tired and isolated. My visits home became more infrequent as Victoria took greater control of Dad's social calendar and daily routine. She'd mention casually that he wasn't feeling up to visitors, or that the doctor had recommended limiting stress and excitement. When I did manage to see him, Victoria would hover nearby, contributing to conversations and steering topics away from anything that might be considered upsetting or complicated. Dad seemed smaller somehow, more fragile, but also more distant, as if he was viewing our relationship through a fog he couldn't clear. The last conversation I had with my father was brief and unsatisfying. I had called to tell him about getting accepted to graduate school, an achievement I was excited to share. Victoria answered the phone and congratulated me politely before explaining that Dad was resting but would be so proud when she told him the news. I asked to speak with him directly, but she said he was having a difficult day and needed to conserve his energy for a doctor's appointment the next morning. She promised he would call me back when he was feeling better, but that call never came. 3 weeks later, Mr. Henderson called with news of Dad's death. Victoria had apparently decided that a small, immediate funeral was what Dad would have wanted, given his condition and desire for privacy in his final months. She'd had him cremated and buried before I even knew he was gone, claiming that she'd tried to reach me but couldn't get through. My phone records showed no missed calls from her number during that time, but challenging her seemed pointless when Dad was already in the ground. The funeral had been attended by Victoria's friends, Dad's business associates, and a few neighbors who had known him for years. Marcus and Melissa had flown in from their respective cities, taken time off from their important jobs to say goodbye to the stepfather who had funded their educations and launched their careers. According to the obituary Victoria had written, Dad was survived by his loving wife and 2 children who would carry on his legacy of hard work and family devotion. I wasn't mentioned at all, as if I had never existed or had died years earlier. Standing in my kitchen that morning, listening to Mr. Henderson's careful words about the will reading, I felt something shift inside me. For 12 years, I had accepted being pushed to the margins of my own family, convinced myself that keeping the peace was worth more than fighting for my place. I had graduated college, started a career, and built a life without expecting anything from Dad's estate, except maybe a small keepsake to remember him by. But now, something in the lawyer's voice suggested that Victoria's version of our family story might not be the final word after all. "Sarah," Mr. Henderson continued, "there are some provisions in your father's will that I think will surprise everyone involved. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There are some things we need to discuss before the formal reading tomorrow." I agreed to meet him, hung up the phone, and sat down at my small kitchen table, staring out the window at the gray morning sky. For the first time in years, I felt something that might have been hope, mixed with a determination I hadn't known I still possessed. The next 24 hours would prove that sometimes the people who think they've won have only been keeping score in a game that isn't over yet. Dad had been quieter in his final years, more withdrawn and apparently less engaged with the world around him. But as I would soon discover, he had been paying attention to things that mattered, keeping track of injustices that others assumed he hadn't noticed, and making decisions that would finally balance scales that had been tipped against me for far too long. Mr. Henderson's office smelled like old books and furniture polish, the kind of place where important decisions had been made for decades. I arrived early, my hands shaking slightly as I signed in with the receptionist. The waiting room felt too quiet, too formal, like a church before a funeral service. When the lawyer finally called me back, his expression was unreadable, professional, but somehow warmer than I'd expected. He closed the door behind us and gestured to a leather chair across from his massive wooden desk. The surface was covered with neat stacks of papers, folders labeled with names I recognized, and a thick document that looked official and intimidating. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and looked at me directly, the way people do when they're about to deliver news that will change everything. "Sarah, I've been your father's attorney for 15 years, he began, his voice steady and careful. During that time, I watched him make many decisions about his estate, but the final changes he made were quite recent and very specific. He picked up the thick document and opened it to a page marked with yellow tabs. Your father came to see me 6 months before he died. He was very clear about what he wanted, and he was very concerned about fairness. The word fairness hit me, like a physical blow. Dad had noticed. After all those years of watching Victoria redistribute his attention, his resources, his very identity around her children, he had been keeping track of the imbalances. Mr. Henderson continued talking, but I was struggling to process the implications of what he was telling me. Dad hadn't been as oblivious as I'd thought. He'd been planning. The house on Maple Street, the one where you grew up, has been left to you entirely, Mr. Henderson said, sliding a document across the desk. Your father was very specific about this. He wanted you to have the family home because, in his words, you were the only one who had ever really lived there as family. I stared at the deed transfer papers, my name typed in official legal font where Victoria's should have been. The house she had transformed, redecorated, and claimed as her own for 12 years was mine. But that wasn't the end of it. Mr. Henderson pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. Your father's construction company, Carter & Sons Building, has been left to you as well. The business assets, the equipment, the client contracts, everything. I felt dizzy. Dad had built that company from nothing when I was a child, working 16-hour days and weekends to establish the reputation that had supported our family for decades. Victoria had always treated it like her personal ATM, but Dad had given it to me. The final revelation was the most shocking. Dad had maintained a separate bank account that Victoria didn't know about, one that had been growing steadily for years. He called it Sarah's Future Fund, Mr. Henderson explained. He'd been setting aside money every month since you started. College. Money that he felt should have gone to your education and support, instead of being absorbed into household expenses for others. The account balance was substantial enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house, and still have a significant nest egg for the future. Victoria and the twins were not left destitute, but their inheritances were much smaller than they had undoubtedly expected. Victoria received a modest cash settlement and her personal belongings. Marcus and Melissa each received small trust funds that would provide some financial security, but nothing approaching the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to. The bulk of Dad's estate, the valuable parts that represented decades of hard work and careful planning, came to me. The formal will reading was scheduled for the following morning at 10 o'clock. Mr. Henderson advised me to arrive a few minutes early partly for practical reasons, but mostly because he anticipated Victoria's reaction would be intense and possibly hostile. He'd seen enough family disputes over inheritances to know that people often revealed their true characters when money was involved. I agreed to be there, but I spent the rest of that day in a strange emotional limbo, alternating between excitement and terror. That evening, I walked through my small apartment, looking at the secondhand furniture and discount store decorations I'd accumulated over the years. Everything I owned could fit in a single moving truck, the accumulated possessions of someone who'd never felt secure enough to invest in anything permanent or expensive. Tomorrow, I would own a house, a business, and enough money to change my life completely. But more than that, I would have proof that Dad had loved me, had seen the injustices I'd endured, and had tried to make things right. I barely slept that night, alternating between rehearsing what I might say to Victoria and trying to imagine what my life would look like moving forward. For 12 years, I'd been the outsider in my own family, watching opportunities and affection flow toward Marcus and Melissa while I scraped by on part-time jobs and partial scholarships. I'd convinced myself that I was stronger for the struggle, that independence was better than dependence, but the truth was that I'd been hurt and angry for years. Tomorrow, that hurt would be validated in the most concrete way possible. The morning of the will reading, I chose my clothes carefully. I wore a simple black dress that looked professional but not expensive, modest jewelry that had belonged to my mother, and shoes that were comfortable enough to run if Victoria completely lost control. I arrived at Mr. Henderson's office 15 minutes early and waited in the parking lot, watching other cars arrive and trying to identify who was inside each one. Victoria arrived precisely on time, driving Dad's luxury sedan and wearing a black suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Marcus and Melissa flanked her as they walked toward the building, both dressed in expensive dark clothing that suggested they were performing the role of grieving stepchildren rather than actually experiencing grief. They moved with the confidence of people who expected to inherit substantially, who had never doubted their place in Dad's affections or his will. The conference room where the reading took place was larger than Mr. Henderson's office, with a long table surrounded by chairs that had been arranged to accommodate everyone mentioned in the will. Victoria sat at one end with Marcus and Melissa on either side, their phones turned face down on the table in a show of respectful attention. I sat across from them, close enough to see their expressions, but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation. Mr. Henderson began with the formal legal language, reading through the opening sections of the will that established Dad's mental competency and the document's legal validity. Victoria nodded along impatiently, clearly eager to get to the distribution of assets. Marcus checked his watch twice, and Melissa examined her manicure with the bored expression of someone attending a mandatory meeting. When Mr. Henderson reached the specific bequests, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. He started with the smaller items, personal belongings, and sentimental objects that had been distributed among various friends and relatives. Victoria received Dad's watch and wedding ring, items that seemed to satisfy her sense of being the primary mourner. Marcus and Melissa were left some of Dad's tools and fishing equipment, gifts that seemed appropriately masculine and practical. Then came the major assets. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and looked directly at me before reading the section about the house. To my daughter Sarah, I leave the family home at 1247 Maple Street, including all property, buildings, and land, to be transferred free and clear of any mortgages or liens. Victoria's head snapped up so fast I thought she might have injured her neck. Her mouth opened and closed without making sound, like a fish gasping for air. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice higher and sharper than usual. "That's our house. James and I lived there together for 12 years. Sarah hasn't lived there since college." Mr. Henderson continued reading without acknowledging her interruption. The section about the construction company provoked an even stronger reaction. Victoria stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward, and demanded to see the document herself. Marcus and Melissa sat in stunned silence as Mr. Henderson explained the reasoning behind Dad's decisions. He had included a letter with the will, written in Dad's own handwriting, that outlined his thoughts about fairness and family obligations. In the letter, Dad acknowledged that he had allowed Victoria to prioritize her own children's needs over mine, and that he regretted not being stronger in protecting my interests while he was alive. The letter was his attempt to correct years of imbalanced treatment and ensure that I received what should have been mine all along. Victoria snatched the letter from Mr. Henderson's hands and read it quickly, her face growing redder with each paragraph. When she finished, she looked at me with pure hatred, the polite mask she'd worn for 12 years completely discarded. "You manipulated him," she hissed. "You got to him somehow when he was sick and confused. This isn't what he really wanted." I sat quietly, letting her words wash over me without responding. Dad's letter spoke for itself, and Mr. Henderson had already confirmed that Dad had been mentally competent when he made these changes. Marcus finally found his voice, asking practical questions about the business and whether the will could be contested. Mr. Henderson explained that Dad had anticipated challenges and had taken steps to ensure the document would hold up in court. He'd undergone psychological evaluation to confirm his mental capacity, had the will witnessed by multiple parties, and had clearly documented his reasoning for the asset distribution. Any legal challenge would be expensive and unlikely to succeed. Melissa burst into tears, but they seemed more like tears of frustration than genuine grief. She'd been counting on Dad's inheritance to fund her lifestyle, and the small trust fund she'd received wouldn't support the expensive habits Victoria had encouraged in both twins. Marcus looked angry but resigned, already calculating how to make the best of a situation that had shifted dramatically in my favor. Victoria gathered her purse and stood to leave, her movements sharp and aggressive. Before walking out, she turned to me one final time and said, "You'll never be able to manage any of this. You don't know anything about running a business or maintaining a house. You'll lose everything within a year and come crawling back for help." I met her gaze steadily and replied, "Maybe, but it'll be my choice to make." After they left, Mr. Henderson and I spent another hour going through the practical details of transferring ownership and managing the transition. The house would need to be cleared of Victoria's belongings. The business would require immediate attention to maintain client relationships, and there were numerous legal and financial details to coordinate. It felt overwhelming, but also exhilarating in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. Walking out of that conference room, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different life. For the first time in 12 years, I wasn't the afterthought, the burden, the one who had to be satisfied with leftovers. Dad had seen what was happening and had found a way to make it right, even though he couldn't do it while he was alive. His final gift wasn't just money or property, it was validation, recognition, and the restoration of my place in the family that had tried so hard to erase me. The drive to Maple Street that afternoon was surreal. I parked in the driveway where Victoria's red convertible used to sit and walked slowly toward the front door, keys heavy in my hand. This house, where I'd grown up and been gradually pushed out, was mine now. The garden where my mother had taught me about plants could be restored. The rooms that had been redecorated to erase our family's history could be reclaimed. For the first time in over a decade, I was going home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.